The slideshow.
On behalf of the Department of English, University of Gour, this is Amit Bhattacharya. Welcome you all to this new session of the online lecture series that our department is organizing. In fact, in view of the COVID-19 situation, we conceived of this idea of a remote lecture series in order to supplement the teaching efforts of our faculty members and also to give a much needed academic exposure to students and scholars of this region. Ultimately, we thought of opening the door of this lecture to outside audience, and today we are very happy to have in our midst Professor Dympna Callaghan. She is the William Safire Professor of Modern Letters, Syracuse University, New York. And today she is going to deliver an online lecture on Shakespeare's freedom of speech. Before I hand over the reins of this program to Professor Callaghan, I would like to say something about her work. Professor Callaghan has had a distinguished career, long distinguished career in teaching and research. She has published very widely on the poets and playwrights of the Renaissance. In fact, Who is Shakespeare? A feminist companion to Shakespeare, and also other books on Shakespeare's sonnets. Actually, that was my first point of contact with her work, Shakespeare's sonnets. And she has co-edited certain volumes of critical articles on Shakespeare. And currently she is engaged in a project looking at the relationship between poetic fluency and the freedom of speech. So we are really very happy to have you in our midst, ma'am. And before I request you to address us, I must request the members of the audience to keep their cameras switched off and their microphones muted. Please don't share your screens, because we are really interested in seeing the PowerPoints also. So without further ado, let me now request Professor Callaghan to address us. It's over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhattacharya. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you everybody for joining in. And I guess one of the unexpected upsides, if you can say such a thing, of this terrible pandemic is that one gets to meet scholars and students that one might otherwise not get to meet, even though it's a virtual meeting. So thank you very much, and I'm just very pleased to be here today. It's evening with you, it's morning with me, so it's very kind of you to come at this time of evening when you could be sitting in front of Netflix or doing whatever else, or having your supper. Anyway, I'll start playing the slideshow, and I hope that works. Shakespeare's freedom of speech, that's my topic today. How do we distinguish between free speech and an assault on the truth? That question has become more urgent and technologically inflected of late. Unfortunately, I can't answer it, but what I can do at least is to demonstrate that some of these issues have been around for a very long time, and that they were as significant to Shakespeare as they are to us. Callaghan, let us be jocund. Will you troll the cat you taught me but whilere? Stephano, come on, Trinculo, let us sing. Flautum and cautum and scoutum and flautum, thought is free. Callaghan, that's not the tune. Ariel plays the tune of a tabor, and pipe, what is the same? This is the tune of our catch. Thought is free is the dissident refrain of a song in The Tempest, urging the mockery and derision of authority, the flouting, couting, and scouting of it. In this jubilant moment, the assembled characters revel in their plot to assassinate Prospero, the colonel and ruler of the isle. That sedition is not spoken here, but rather celebrated in a rollicking song or troll, makes it potentially less threatening. Thus, the audience need not fear that The Tempest, which is listed as a comedy in the first folio, and is a play in which everyone survives, is going to turn suddenly into the tragedy of Macbeth, where the ruler is actually killed. Thought is free was a common proverb. Shakespeare used it in Twelfth Night as well as in The Tempest, and he alludes to it in Othello and Measure for Measure. The catch or round in The Tempest requires 3 voices to sing the same song beginning at different times, so that the final line is repeated 3 times by the singers. Thought is free, thought is free, thought is free. The irony here is that in early modern England, it really wasn't. And this will be the burden of my song tonight, because I want to explore the paradox that the greatest writer in the history of English literature lived in a world where, although both eloquence and plain speaking were prized, there were nonetheless formidable restrictions on what kind of thoughts could be expressed. Now, I just want to check before I go on that you can all hear me still. So, Amit, will you let me know if, just text me if there's any problem with the sound or anything like that, but I'm assuming we're still all good. Okay, so this irony that thought isn't free, let alone speech, that's my topic today. While we might assume that poetic license, an expression used in England since the 14th century, would get literature off the hook in terms of what could be written, that term did not mean that poets were entitled to say anything. It meant only that they had the imaginative freedom to depart from history and fact. Further, the prerogative to exercise liberty of conscience, specifically in relation to religious belief, was not established in English law at this time. Historically, of course, it was not only heretical thought that was regarded as dangerous, but a whole range of ideas and opinions that might be deemed immoral or seditious, and a threat to political and social stability. Ironically then, thought was free as long as it stayed put in the head. But one of the problems with thought is that our ideas and beliefs are rarely hermetically sealed within the brain, forever confined to the privacy of our own minds. Rather, thought tends to escape, in the first instance as speech, and perhaps subsequently as action. In other words, thoughts almost invariably lead to other things. Even Elizabeth I, who famously said she didn't wish to make windows into men's souls, nonetheless lived in constant fear that her subjects might be persuaded that their true allegiance was not to her, but to the Pope in Rome. So she feared that thought, dissident religious thought, might become a threat to her person in the form of assassination. Early modern clergy, too, often stressed the limits of freedom of thought. For example, Gervase Babington expounded the meaning of the 10th commandment, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife," etc., as the sin of thought rather than deed. Babington opined, a strange doctrine, no doubt, to many who think their thought is free. Similarly, George Gifford, writing in 1583, observed, quote, "The law of God is not as the law of princes, that a man can say thought is free, but it bindeth as well the inward parts of the mind," unquote. Thought, then, might be free, at least in theory, but speech, both spoken and written, certainly was not. The Privy Council, the Bishop of London, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Stationers' Company, and the Master of the Revels all worked to police literary production. Interestingly, plays and poems were sometimes censored or suppressed after performance or printing, as well as before it. Ben Jonson was imprisoned in 1597 for his part in the Isle of Dogs, which allegedly instigated a riot among spectators. This triggered the Privy Council to issue an order for the demolition of all playhouses, though in the end they were simply shuttered for 3 months. While I'm sure we would all love to know what was in that play that caused such a stir, we don't know because it has not survived, probably because any copies of it were destroyed. Christopher Marlowe, whose greatness had he lived would have rivaled Shakespeare's, was stabbed to death in a tavern at the age of only 29 in 1593, likely at the government's behest, and his translation of Ovid's erotic elegies was burnt on episcopal orders in 1599. Shakespeare's colleague in the Lord Chamberlain's company, the actor Augustine Phillips, was hauled up before the Privy Council in February 1601 for performing what was by then an old play about deposing a weak monarch. That play was Shakespeare's Richard II. While the play had already been censored in print, and perhaps also in performance, it posed a new problem in 1601, because this time Phillips and his fellow actors had accepted a commission to stage the play the night before the ill-fated rebellion of the Earl of Essex. Queen Elizabeth is reported to have said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" Unquote. Another example of the restrictions writers had to contend with is to be found in relation to Shakespeare's As You Like It, which refers explicitly to attempts on the part of the authorities to suppress plays and poetry. In As You Like It, we find out, since the little wit that fools have was silenced, the little foolery that wise men have makes a great show. This is either a reference to what is known as the Bishop's Ban, that is the decree of June 1599 by the Bishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, prohibiting print publication of satires and epigrams, or the silencing referred to here may be the repeated attempts on the part of the City of London authorities to suppress theatre. As You Like It, a perennially popular play, celebrates the freedom to be found in the Forest of Arden. And indeed, the character Jaques even declares, "I must have liberty." However, the play also makes pointed reference both to the murder of Christopher Marlowe, who was stabbed to death at Eleanor Bull's Tavern in Deptford, allegedly in an altercation over the tab, known as, in early modern parlance, as the Reckoning. In the play, the clown Touchstone says, "When a man's verses cannot be understood, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room." Here, Shakespeare makes a pun on reckoning as the bill and the idea of the final reckoning of death and the last judgment. That Marlowe's assailant was in the pay of the authorities made the story about his death an implausible account of his murder, a suspicion that is also voiced in As You Like It, when Shakespeare makes a further pun on reckoning as account, both in the sense of an amount owed in a tavern, but also in the sense of the account or report of what transpired there. Celia, who is in the play the lively companion of Rosalind, the cross-dressed heroine, asserts that the oath of a lover is no stronger than the word of a tapster or barkeeper, who is likely to tally the bill to his own advantage. They are both the confirmer of false reckonings. The implication, then, is that the official story of Marlowe's death is false. Shakespeare is sailing pretty close to the wind here. This is not, of course, to suggest that the play is merely an allegory of dark matters. It is not. In fact, it is very funny, but it is heavily elusive and includes reference to the illicit printing and distribution of documents that were deemed to be heretical, known as the Marpullet Tracts. This occurs through the character named Oliver Martext and by means of jokes about marring poetry manuscripts, to whose relentless manuscript publication in the forest, Orlando, the lover of the play, is unshakably committed. So why would Shakespeare believe he could get away with these allusions to delicate and dangerous political matters? Well, importantly, the entire play is set in the Forest of Arden, the green world far away from civilization, where the order of the everyday world is inverted, and thus a woman, the heroine Rosalind, can disguise herself in male attire. This is the topsy-turvy world, or the world upside down, which it is the privilege of comedy to explore. It is a place of licensed misrule, where the order of ordinary life is suspended for a defined and limited period, just like the carnival days celebrated all over early modern Europe. The forest is also what is known as a locus amoenus, an idealized safe haven from the dangers and depredations of court and urban life, an Arcadia. When the character Amiens sings, "Under the greenwood tree, who loves to lie with me," he celebrates the sexual freedom of the forest. However, there is also potentially an allusion to John Greenwood, who was hanged for printing heretical tracts, and whom we know from the records of Corpus Christi College at Cambridge University, was a companion of Christopher Marlowe's. Marlowe bought him dinner on several occasions. Greenwood was hanged in 1593. In what seems like more than a coincidence, his associate, John Penry, who had been engaged in the clandestine operation of a printing press in the forest, was hanged the very day before Marlowe was murdered on May 30th, 1593. The allusions charted above are too enmeshed in Elizabethan topicality for us to catch nowadays in performance, but their discovery gives the lie to the still prevalent idea that Shakespeare, more than his contemporaries, played it safe. Certainly, Elizabethan audiences who were avid consumers of news would have been alert to such references. One reference in As You Like It that seems particularly anodyne, totally harmless in fact, is the mention of Shakespeare's favourite poet, Ovid, but it wasn't. The clown Touchstone tells his love interest, the rustic Audrey, that now he is in the forest, away from the court. He is like, quote, honest Ovid among the Goths, unquote. Ovid was exiled from Rome to a remote port on the Black Sea by the Emperor Augustus in 8 BC. He had run afoul most spectacularly of the political regime of his day, and everyone in early modern England knew that he had provoked imperial opprobrium. His crime, he said, was carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. The poem is usually thought to be the Ars Amatoria, or the art of love, about sex in the city of Rome. His actual transgression was probably not indecent verse. It was much more likely to have been his sly parody of the emperor in the final book of his most famous poem. Was that cool? Beg your pardon, have we got a problem? Okay, I'm just going to stop there because there seems to be some issue. Are we okay to proceed?
No, ma'am, it's fine. We can hear you.
You can't hear me.
We can hear you. It's okay. It's fine.
Can you see the slideshow?
Yes, of course.
It's perfectly all right. Please go.
Oh, okay.
Please proceed.
Okay. So I'll just start at the top of the page again. Ovid was exiled from Rome to a remote port on the Black Sea by the Emperor Augustus in 8 BCE. He had run afoul most spectacularly of the political regime of his day, and everyone in early modern England knew that he had provoked imperial opprobrium. His crime, he said, was carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. The poem is usually thought to be the Ars Amatoria, or the art of love, about sex in the city of Rome. His actual transgression was probably not indecent verse. it was much more likely to have been his sly parody of the emperor in the final book of his most famous poem, The Metamorphoses. Ovid then was the bad boy poet of ancient Rome, eloquent, gifted beyond all measure, and a thorn in the side of the emperor. And according to Francis Mears, writing in 1598, Shakespeare was just like him. The sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare, Mears said. Mears here commends the aesthetic qualities, the expressive metrical fluency of Shakespeare's verse. But when he aligns Shakespeare with Ovid, he inescapably intimates the political dangers of poetic fluency as well. We do not know where or precisely when As You Like It was first performed. It could have been at the Globe, which was safely outside London's city walls, to the south of the River Thames, and thus beyond the jurisdiction of the city fathers. Or it could have been for a special Shrove Tuesday, which correlates with our Mardi Gras, a Shrove Tuesday performance at court on February the 20th, 1599. That is, in a designated period of licensed carnivalesque misrule, a holiday time when the liberties of the poet-playwright might be expanded. However, as we have noted, there were, in As You Like It, a lot of red flags that the state and civic authorities might have noticed. And in fact, the play was stayed from publication in 1600. Stayed means publication was halted. As You Like It did not appear in print, in fact, until 1623, when it appeared in the first folio, that is the collection of Shakespeare's plays, assembled by members of Shakespeare's company 7 years after his death. And I think that's quite remarkable that As You Like It never appeared in print during Shakespeare's lifetime. And as we know from Lucas Ernst's work, Shakespeare was very much concerned with the printing of his work as well as its performance. While staying was often a matter of simply delaying publication, frequently as a means of registering an early modern form of copyright with the stationer's company, all the other plays stayed for publication in 1600 appeared in print in a matter of weeks or months. Only As You Like It had to wait 23 years before being printed, 20 years into the reign of James I and 7 years after the death of its author. Thus staying functioned in this instance as a means of suppressing publication altogether. On the other hand, early modern restrictions on literature did not always function in the way we might expect. Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare's great homage to Ovid, which was based on Book 10 of the Metamorphoses, was published in pamphlet form without any official objection. Indeed, the poem was entered into the Stationer's Register with a notice that it had been authorised by none other than the Archbishop of Canterbury on April 18th, 1593. Given the profoundly erotic nature of the poem, as well as Queen Elizabeth's proclamation of the same year ordering a crackdown on the publication of material deemed, quote, unseemly for Christian ears, unquote, it is hard to believe that the poem got through what was, albeit sporadically, the very tight apparatus of the censoring ecclesiastical authority. Further, the Order of 1593 followed in the wake of numerous previous attempts to control erotic literature. For example, the Common Council of London passed an ordinance in 1574 aimed at content, what Elizabethans called the matter of the entertainment, the, quote, words and, quote, doings, especially those that tended toward, quote, unchastity, sedition, and such like, unquote. The Privy Council's order of 1582 had attempted to prohibit the teaching of Ovid in schools. One member of Parliament opined that while an heathen emperor had the good sense to exile Ovid and his filthy poems, they were now being taught in Christian grammar schools. Had Elizabethan moralists succeeded in banning Ovid in schools, undoubtedly we would not now have Shakespeare as we know him. In 1583, another bill was put forward in Parliament attempting to ban altogether, quote, unprofitable and idle pamphlets, lewd and wanton discourses of love. And remember that Venus and Adonis, like the poem published a year later, Lucrece, the two Appilia, were both published in this pamphlet form, and increasingly pamphlets were associated with dissidence, with dissent, with the promulgation of unorthodox ideas, because there were so many political pamphlets. In light of all this, one might wonder indeed if the Archbishop who approved the publication of Venus and Adonis had actually read Shakespeare's poem. One can only assume that he, or more likely his clerical underlings, were more focused on stalling the publication of heretical tracts that posed an explicit threat to the established religion of the Church of England than in censoring what was regarded as salacious verse. And I believe that that was indeed the case. The fact that Venus and Adonis was dedicated to Shakespeare's illustrious patron, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, no doubt also helped ease its passage to print. However, that Venus and Adonis escaped the net of censorship should not blind us to the continual pressure on literature to conform to religious morality. One writer indeed argued that there was already ample legislation against seditious texts, but not enough to staunch the tide of what was regarded as perhaps a more insidious form of corruption. Quote, "I will not speak of books slanderous to the state, pernicious in every way, because there be statutes to lay hold on them." Unquote. Venus and Adonis was immensely popular and was known as a, quote, wanton pamphlet, unquote. So what was wanton about it? Of course, any representation of an oversexed, powerful woman might be thought to constitute a satirical glance at the Virgin Queen herself. But Venus and Adonis is also an unapologetically pagan poem about young Adonis who prefers chasing boars to chasing women. He even refuses the blatant and insistent sexual invitations of the goddess of love herself. At one point, she invites him to kiss her bosom and to graze lower where the pleasant fountains lie. Whereas in Ovid, the story is one of the tragic ending of a great love affair between Venus and Adonis, when Adonis is killed in a boar hunting accident. Shakespeare has given the story a humorous twist. Adonis isn't at all interested in Venus, but he does seem rather worryingly interested in the boar, and his death is described as a sexual consummation. "'Tis true, thus was Adonis slain. He ran upon the boar with his sharp spear, who did not whet his teeth at him again, but by a kiss thought to persuade him there, and nuzzling in his flank the loving swine, sheathed unaware the tusk in his soft groin." The risque sexual intimation here makes fun of the well-nigh obsessive concern of Elizabethan moralists in the wake of legislation first enacted in 1534 against what was euphemistically termed filthiness with a beast. Beyond legal restrictions and political pressure, however, there were more specific protocols that helped shape literary language. Fundamentally, what enabled Venus and Adonis to escape censure was its genre, its literary category, the little epic, or epyllium. The subjects of this genre were typically mythological. In the political climate of the 1590s, myth was a place of greater safety, where Shakespeare, like his predecessor Ovid, could skirt the boundary between the permissible and the licentious. Shakespeare creates the lush, sensual world of sexual license within a very tightly organized verse framework, and he repeats that form in all 1,194 lines of the poem. It is therefore just as important to remember that Shakespeare embraced the technical restrictions of his craft as it is to be aware of the legal impediments to the practice of it. Comedy, whether in plays or poems, offers a certain license to speak more freely than is afforded by other genres. Shakespeare's most famous tragic character, Hamlet, is not outspoken. We hear quite a lot from him during the course of the play, but his 8 soliloquies are not public declarations. As you will remember, thought was free only to a very limited extent, and so we overhear his private meditations. Soliloquies represent freedom of expression in a culture that did not typically condone it. In the court of his wicked uncle Claudius, Hamlet cannot voice his suspicion that the king is a usurper who has murdered his father, or his fear that his mother may have colluded in the regicide. In 1599, a year before Hamlet was written, Sir John Hayward cautioned, quote, "It is a common saying that thought is free, free indeed from punishment of secular laws, except by word or deed it break forth into action. Yet the secret thoughts against the sacred majesty of a prince, without attempt, without endeavour, have been adjudged worthy of death," unquote. In the context of culture at court, another writer warns that, quote, "The courtier may freely think whatsoever he pleaseth, for, as our English proverb says, thought is free, but let him take heed that he speak not openly, what he hath in his heart conceived privily." So the idea that you can somehow police thought, because presumably it leaves some kind of trace in in speech or in action. Despite having been publicly named as Claudius's successor, or perhaps because of it, Hamlet is keenly aware of the limitations on what he can say, and that speech in all its forms can be politically dangerous. "I must hold my tongue." He says that in the very second scene of his first scene of appearance in the play. Nor is this paranoia on Hamlet's part, since Claudius has arranged for him to be sent to England with a letter ordering his execution. "Arm you, I pray you, to this speedy voyage, for we will fetters put about this fear that now goes too free-footed." And I just want you to look at the alliteration there. "Arm you, I pray you, to this speedy voyage, for we will fetters put about this fear which now goes too free-footed." This passage is the antithesis of the great poetry of the play, with its flexible verse lines, which are the very hallmarks of Shakespeare's own free speech. Wicked characters in Shakespeare, just like Claudius, always want to chain up language, while good ones invariably wish to unleash it. The verb to fetter means to shackle the feet. And the other thing to be aware of here is that feet refers to the metrical units in a line of verse. Those 5 alliterative F's around that central word, fetters, work to bind this quasi-personified fear that has been dangerously at large. And that final alliterative free-footed, which means something like footloose, ironically puts the double lock on it. This is figuratively, brilliantly binding language. And the idea of language, especially poetic language, as itself potentially an instrument of bondage, was in the period a pervasive idea. Restricting speech, the regulation of words, of language, was in fact a central project of the mid-16th to mid-17th centuries. Little wonder then that early modern England did not possess the concept of free speech in our modern sense as an inalienable right. However, this idea was articulated as an aspect of the rhetorical category, freeness of speech as it was called, which existed only in relation to specifically public discourse. Thomas Wilson's popular book, The Art of Rhetoric, offered the following definition. Freeness of speech is when we speak boldly and without fear, even to the proudest of them, whatsoever we please or have list to speak. In other words, whatever we want to say. Freedom of speech, freeness of speech rather, then is an especially direct way of speaking, aimed at truthfulness rather than persuasion or entertainment. From the Greeks on, this form of speech was understood as a vital component of counsel. Thus, 4 of Shakespeare's kings, Cymbeline, Henry V, Henry VI, and Henry VIII, all utter the words, quote, speak freely, unquote, words that are spoken by no other characters in the plays, who instead more often complain about restrictions on what they can say. This type of audaciously free speech is about giving ruthlessly honest counsel to rulers rather than simply flattering them so as not to incite their wrath. Freeness of speech in this sense was a classical code of conduct, appropriate only to an elite minority of free male citizens. Even those who demand accountability at the beginning of Coriolanus and cry, speak, speak, to their representative, the first citizens, are citizens rather than plebeians. The person who's going to speak is a citizen. Women and social inferiors did not share the privilege of speech. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet implores her father, Capulet, "Good father, I beseech you on my knees. Good father, I beseech you on my knees, hear me with patience, but to speak a word." His response is predictable. Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. The matter at hand is, of course, that Capulet wants Juliet to marry the County Paris, but she is already secretly married to Romeo. Enraged by his daughter's refusal, Capulet orders her to proceed with the wedding. "Fettle your fine joints 'gainst Thursday next, or go with Paris to St. Peter's Church, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither." This language, "I will drag thee on a hurdle thither," is instructive because bound to a hurdle, a flat sledge-like frame, was exactly how traitors and heretics were transported, or rather dragged, to Tyburn and other places of execution. By this, the audience is ready for Juliet to suffer an analogous form of punishment for her attempt to speak freely. Her garrulous nurse makes a bold intervention and tells Capulet that he is wrong to berate his daughter thus. Quote, "I speak no treason. May not one speak?" Question mark. This is Act 3, Scene 5. And I think the answer to that, may not one speak, is clearly no, one may not. This line is an important one because it further reminds the audience that disobedience in the household was understood in English common law as petty treason, a lesser form of treason. It wasn't high treason, which could only be committed against the sovereign, but it was treason nonetheless, and the consequences for Juliet do indeed prove deadly. Similarly, for Hamlet, speaking up would cost him his life. The problem of Hamlet's restricted speech, his stifled dissent in the regime of his usurping uncle, is paramount in that play. Unlike some of Shakespeare's characters in Shakespeare's other plays, such as Othello's Iago, whose malevolent speeches alone on stage address the audience in a very direct way, Hamlet really does seem to be talking to himself. That the audience overhears his self-addressed expressions increases the sense of an inscrutable inner life. What he describes to the prying Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as the heart of my mystery. For all that, there is also a sense of urgency about wanting to disclose and unburden the self by means of unfettered speech. This is especially significant since Hamlet's very first soliloquy ends with the anguish of wanting to speak, and yet he is unable to do so within the political context of Elsinore. "But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue." While here Hamlet has something in common with Shakespeare's deposed Richard II, who says, "My heart is great, but it must break with silence." Perhaps surprisingly, Hamlet has even more in common with the truculent and voluble Kate in The Taming of the Shrew. "Why, sir," "Why, sir, I trust I may have leave to speak, and speak I will. I am no child, no babe. Your betters have endured me say my mind, and if you cannot, best you stop your ears. My tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break, and rather than it shall, I will be free, even to the uttermost, as I please in words." A common proverbial expression was that grief pent up will break the heart, and editorial commentaries on this passage invariably associate Kate's lines with the saying, light troubles speak, immense troubles are silent. But this is not grief, I would argue. This is rage against the impediments to speech that Kate's new husband imposes upon her. She is, after all, being deprived of the, quote, leave, unquote, or permission to speak. I trust I may have leave to speak. In Euripides' Phoenician Women, there is a stark articulation of an idea that was also current in early modern Europe, when Jocasta asks her son, what is the worst thing about being exiled? He replies, one thing most of all, he cannot speak his mind, unquote. Jocasta is speaking quite literally when she concludes, this is a slave's lot thou describest, to refrain from uttering what one thinks. The malevolent Iago echoes a related sentiment when he asserts his right not to speak. He insinuates the falsehood that Desdemona is unfaithful in response to Othello's "What dost thou think?" ? Bear in mind here that Othello is himself a former slave. Yet according to Iago, slaves are free to conceal what they think. Though I am bound to every act of duty, I am not bound to all that slaves are free to utter my thoughts. As Iago continues to plant suspicions about Desdemona, Othello asks him plainly, what dost thou mean? By heaven, I'll know thy thoughts. Iago, you cannot, if my heart were in your hand, nor shall not, whilst 'tis in my custody. So this is very different idea of the heart containing thought, very different from those earlier notions that somehow or other thought would leak out dangerously in speech or in action that we saw in some of the religious and political commentaries. Wickedness then clearly consists in the attempt to conceal thoughts, and goodness in the desire to reveal them. In The Taming of the Shrew, Kate has no clandestine desire, and this is important for how we evaluate her character. Indeed, Kate's "I will be free, even to the uttermost, as I please in words," is the most powerful claim to free speech in all of Shakespeare. Kate's speech, of course, is not a soliloquy. She speaks directly to the other characters, and what restricts her speech is her gender rather than the kind of political predicament by which the Prince of Denmark is hamstrung. Female speech was often regarded as inherently transgressive, and it was all too easy, as authors like Kay Stanton have shown, for voluble or loquacious women to be branded as whores. In Othello, for example, Desdemona, who before his opinion of her was poisoned by Iago, was valued by her husband for her, quote, free and bounteous mind, unquote, and because she, quote, speaks freely, unquote. Accused of infidelity, she is murdered, as she declares, for my free speech. I mean, that's really a remarkable line. Language and the particular restraints imposed on it shape and constrain human and especially female identity, even though, as many feminist scholars have argued, many more women put pen to paper in this period than we might imagine. So there are female writers, but there's still these constraints on women speaking. When Hamlet welcomes the players to Elsinore, in reference to the actor playing the female role, he asserts, "The lady shall say her mind freely, or the blank verse shall halt for't." The lady shall say her mind freely, or the blank verse shall halt for't. This is a sharp contrast to his instructions for the comedians of the troupe, quote, "Let those that play your clowns speak no more than is set down for them." Clowns were notorious for ad-libbing, which comes from ad libitum, the Latin for speak as you please. The lady's lines, however, should be, as Polonius says a little later in commendation of Hamlet's own recitation, well spoken, with good accent and good discretion, unquote. If the actor does not speak with fluid expression, the verse will sound stilted or out of rhythm. However, there is also the sense that the female character will be allowed free and perhaps uninterrupted speech, and Shakespeare connects this freedom of speech directly with poetic fluency. If she is not given leave to speak freely, the metre of the verse will be lame or halting. Crucially, these lines reference the verse form that Shakespeare used most often in his plays, namely blank verse, which, because it was unrhymed, was described by his contemporary John Florio as, quote, at liberty, loose and free, unquote. Of course, one of the things we'd all love to know is what Shakespeare, the man himself, felt about free speech. Unfortunately, he didn't testify before Congress or Parliament, or write to the Times, or post on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. Sonnet 66, however, offers a complaint of extraordinary candour against restrictions on free speech, when Shakespeare protests famously against art made tongue-tied by authority. Tired with all these for restful death, I cry, as to behold desert a beggar born, and needy nothing trimmed in jollity, and purest faith unhappily forsworn, and gilded honour shamefully misplaced, and maiden virtue rudely strumpeted, and right perfection wrongfully disgraced, and strength by limping sway disabled, and art made tongue-tied by authority, and folly doctor-like controlling skill, and simple truth miscalled simplicity, and captive good attending captain ill. Tired with all these, from these would I be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone. Now, it is tempting to read this as Shakespeare's own opinion, but I would caution against that, first because I don't think Shakespeare could ever afford to be so unguarded, and secondly because literature itself demands that a poet adopt a persona on account of the fact that there is always a gap, sometimes narrow and sometimes chasm wide, between the words on the page and the person who penned them. Virginia Woolf made this point in A Room of One's Own, written in 1928, when she declared that she would make use of, quote, all the liberties and licenses of a, unquote, of a writer, but that the word I is only a convenient term for somebody, she said, who has no real being. This is especially true in relation to the sonnets, where Shakespeare is also entering a tradition emanating from the 14th century poet Francesco Petrarch, so that the speaker of the sonnets both is and is not Shakespeare, his language modulated by and in dialogue with the tropes and figures that had gone before. This is a complicated point because language is never entirely or freely belongs to us. It is always pre-owned, never fully authentic. And aware of this, writers nearly always don a mask, which in early modern England may also have served a protective function. I'm aware now that masks mean something, have come to acquire even greater significance to us during the pandemic. We must bear in mind this mask-like protective function when we look at Sonnet 66, in which Shakespeare comes perilously close to a direct and overtly political complaint about the suppression of creative speech. The sonnet begins with the line, tired with all these, for restful death I cry, and then proceeds to give a list of all the social injustices that exhaust him. Among them, deserving people who get nothing, worthless people who get everything, honours given to those who least deserve them, and the virtuous who achieve only social disgrace. This is an extraordinarily moving and melancholy poem, beginning with the conventional idea that death offers respite from the exhausting trials and tribulations of life. However, the poet's death wish has not been caused by the inevitable turbulence of life in general, but by particular social and political circumstances. This sonnet conveys through repetition the oppressive burden of the social maladies it enumerates. With each of the 10 successive iterations of the word and, that weight gets heavier. There is a sense of the unrelenting nature of social ills, which are being itemised like a bill, a reckoning, the awful cost of which is to be paid by the poet. In the catalogue of social injustices that take up 11 lines of the sonnet's 14, the most obtrusive complaint is, and art made tongue-tied by authority. This is not only because it speaks to the political forces that constrict the poet's voice, but also because tongue-tied is what's known in technical terms as a spondy, a metrical foot of two stressed syllables, tum-tum, rather than the typical unstressed stress pattern of titum, titum, titum. So it's tum-tum. Art in this period could refer to any form of skilled labour, but art in combination with the suppression of speech points dangerously toward the stifled expressions of the muddled poet himself. This is a society in which the poet doesn't have a voice in the sense of access to political power. Interestingly, voting in county and parliamentary elections occurred by the vocal assent of the severely restricted class of electors, giving their voices, as it was called, to candidates. You know, you shout it out. It is a world in which the speaker of the sonnet cannot speak up. There is a paradox in this, since the poet describes the restrictions on what he can say, while all the while saying it with exquisite precision. Yet for all that it is a cri de coeur, the sonnet does not end with a rallying cry for resistance. Instead, it ends almost by way of retraction, as a love poem, arguing that were the poet to die, he would leave his lover alone. The implication is that in such a corrupt world as the one he has described, love is the only thing worth living for. My final brief example of the restrictions of speech imposed by authority is from King Lear, which is a play that is about the impossibility both of speaking truth to power and of the powerless speaking their truth. The king demands flattery, even though receiving it will be his ruin. Lear's fool, who has a certain license to speak because he is the court jester, says, "I will hold my tongue." And the honest counsellor Kent is ignored and banished. However, the most important character in the play is the one who is most unquestionably tongue-tied by authority. Cordelia's refusal to cooperate with her father's imperious demand that his daughters compete for portions of his kingdom by telling him how much they love him, nonetheless constitutes not only a form of filial disobedience, but also a potentially treasonous act. As her sisters are laying the flattery on with a trowel, the audience hears her perplexed aside. What shall Cordelia speak? Love and be silent. Cordelia realizes that her only ethical choice is to respond to her father with, "Nothing, my lord." Of course, Cordelia does not remain silent. She explains that she refuses to use the, quote, glib and oily, unquote, art of rhetoric to appease her father because she is committed to telling him the truth. And this is the rhetorical form of parrhesia, you know, what Foucault has more recently termed speaking truth to power. "Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all?" Unquote. King Lear explores the possibilities of unfettered speech and implicitly asks, how can a woman speak out without deadly consequences? The answer in this play is that she cannot, and it is not an accident that Lear's poignant and tragic delusion is that he can still hear Cordelia speak after she is dead. "Ha! What is't thou sayest?" But at that point, she can literally say nothing. To conclude, the repressive forces that at times impeded Shakespeare's composition are very different from those we associate with modern systems of censorship. They are, for example, less uniform and systematic. Shakespeare, like his contemporaries, no doubt had to dodge, weave, and maneuver around the censorship apparatus of his day. But more important was his expressive capacity in poetry, his way with words, and that, more than anything, endowed Shakespeare with real freedom of speech. So,
Thank you. Thank you, madam, for this wonderful presentation. We're really spellbound and tongue-tied while listening to you. Now, I think we should give the freedom of speech, or at least, at any rate, the freedom of writing to the audience to ask questions, make observations. So with your permission, let me now throw the session open for questions and comments. My colleague, Dr. Shonipendra Banerjee, may all please moderate the questions.
Yes, yeah. I'm waiting for the questions to appear in the chat box. Yeah, Devaditya Mukhopadhyay is asking, may I request you to let us know whether we can see Kent's speeches in the opening act of King Lear along the lines of your arguments regarding Shakespeare's engagement with freedom of speech? The opening line of Kent, yeah.
Sorry? I'm sorry, I missed that last bit.
No, I'm done. The opening lines of Kent.
Okay, so I think Kent embodies, he is Parrhesiastes, as it's called in rhetorical form. He is the one of the counselors who's going to speak the truth, and which obviously Lear can't cope with. So I absolutely think it's very important. He's one of the characters. There are Cordelia, Kent, and obviously in relation to the subplot, Edgar try and tell truth to their kind of patriarchal, tyrannous fathers, and it's very difficult to do that. So I think all of these figures are figures who express the rhetorical form of parousia, this function of speaking truth to power. But remember, rhetorically, it doesn't mean anybody can speak truth to power. It means, and it's totally appropriate with Kent. Even Kent can't speak truth to power, even though he should be in a position to do it, because it is about honest counsel, so that you're not just flattering the monarch. And obviously, people would have remembered the reign of Henry VIII, when it was very important to flatter the monarch, because otherwise you'd end up dead. And even if you're flattered, that might not work in the long run. So I think this has a lot of resonance for those who advise leaders, and that flattery is certainly not the way. And this glib and oily art, is the thing that Cordelia particularly condemns. So the good characters are all for speaking the truth, even at a cost. But we find that the cost in King Lear is too great. So thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Sharbani Banerjee, Professor Sharbani Banerjee is asking, she's referring to Touchstone. Touchstone in As You Like It is speaking of the freedom of the wind. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, that's interesting, because the speech and words are associated with, the idea that the wind is free, but also that another word for breath in the period is wind. And the Latin is spiritus, which means both spirit, but also literally the inspiration of the breath. And poets are often interested in how you control the breath through metrical means. So this is an ideal, being free to the wind, or Jaques, I must have liberty with all. What does that mean in this period? And I mean, famously, the historian Joel Hirschfield said, we might ask whether freedom of speech meant anything to Shakespeare in our modern sense. And he said it probably didn't mean very much, because, it's certainly not a right. People find freedom of speech dangerous, and yet there's this pressure, especially, you can enunciate it more freely in the comedies, but there's clearly, no such thing. In the forest, in this limited set of circumstances, maybe, but not when you get back to the court. So those are the limits on it. So there are limits on this kind of utopian ideal.
Right. Indrajit Chattopadhyay is asking, if the freedom of speech was quite censored by the Office of the Master of Revels, wasn't that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think I gave the examples there, that the Master of Revels and the Stationers' Company, there are, and the fact that As You Like It. I mean, could you hear the whole talk? But, you know, I know sometimes it's difficult to convey in these means, but, you know, I gave a number of examples, especially with As You Like It, which isn't printed when it's, you know, soon after what we think is its first performance. It's only printed in 1623 in the first folio. So, and it stayed from publication in 1600. Every other play that stayed for publication, which is not necessarily censorship, you know, it's just a kind of, it's sort of so that you can place a form of early modern copyright on it, so that, you know, other companies can't get at it. That every other play is from that time is actually printed within weeks, or, you know, and I think maybe in one case in months. But As You Like It never appears, and I think it's because it's kind of a dangerous play. So there is a censorship apparatus, and yet there are these articulations about free speech. You know, so it's both things. Yes. I mean, it's just like, you know, and what I'm trying to say is that I think there's an analogy here between, you know, freedom of speech in general, in the political sense, and the capacity to speak poetically, which is constrained by technical phenomenon. And, you know, you remember that Ezra Pound, you know, said to break the pentameter, that was the first heave, and the advent of free, so-called free verse, that is verse that did not did not meet any kind of metrical form or requirement. But by 1918, Pound himself was saying, actually, this verse is just as bad as the horrible Victorian verse that went before it, that had, you know, meter and rhyme, and it's not really entirely been a success. So there's that, you know, this notion that language, that the structures of language are confining, but they are also a means of expression. And I think this is directly analogous to this sense that, you know, what would Shakespeare have said if there had been no restrictions on speech, no Master of the Revels, no Stationers' Company where you had to register things, no suppression of plays where, you know, he knew that his colleagues had been imprisoned for the play The Isle of Dogs, or Augustine Phillips picked up by the authorities for having performed Richard II. The apparatus of censorship is definitely, you know, at work, and yet the irony of that is that we have this incredible poetry as a result, and I'm very interested in that. Whereas if you can say anything, this is not to advocate censorship, mind you, but we can say anything, but none of us have managed to come up with the works of Shakespeare. And that's also interesting, that while we've had so many technological developments, there are wonderful works of literature being produced in all languages as we speak, but nothing they're just different. They're not better than what went before. There isn't that mode of progress. And again, so it's not just the capacity to say anything, it's also sort of how you say it. But language is in itself, it is inherently a means of expression and a limitation on expression. Words confine us as much as they free us. That's the inherent kind of contradiction of linguistic expression.
Yes, ma'am. Professor Debopriyo Pal wants you to comment on Measure for Measure. Particularly, it has been revived in Russia, in the context of Russia, recently by Cheek by Joel.
Well, I'm not familiar with that production. Right. Measure for Measure, you know, but so I can't really speak about Russia, or, you know, and I don't really know, about censorship in Russia. I can say, I beg your pardon?
Measure for Measure in general, maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the fascinating thing, the thing that most strikes me, is that at the end of that play, Isabella doesn't say anything. You know, she doesn't say, you know, she's silent when it's proposed that she will marry the Duke. And obviously her advocacy for her brother is twisted. It's used against her by Angelo you know, as he tries to blackmail her. So, you know, speaking up for women, especially for female characters, particularly difficult. And then this business of silence. And I think, excuse me, on stage, it's always very interesting to see when characters are rendered mute. You know, other characters like Lucentio, they're witty, but they're not kind of admirable in any way. They simply speak, but without any of the kind of intent or objective that say an Isabella does. The other thing I think about this is, you know, one of those moments where there's there is Angelo wants to pull all the boarding houses down, and freedom of speech is also associated with sexual license, and that play in particular explores the conditions and limits of sexual behavior. You know, would you geld all the youth of the city? You know, the idea that, would that be possible? Could you really impose a situation like this? Could you really constrain people in that way? So this expands not just to freedom of speech, but freedom in general. And that pull all the houses down. It's not just the boarding houses. The boarding houses, remember, are also associated with playhouses. So I think there's that connection. And obviously, given where the globe is situated on the South Bank, very near all those brothels, there is this association between, I don't want to say sexual freedom, because it's not particularly sexual freedom for the women who the sex workers who are there, the women who are branded as whores, often very poor women who have no other means of life. But there is this notion that sexual expression and freedom of expression are correlated, and Shakespeare explores that specifically in Measure for Measure. And I think that's all, you know, this business that in the period there's just huge concern about erotic language and erotic verse. It doesn't really get anywhere till till Cromwell. But there's constant puritanical pressure about controlling, especially sexual behaviour. And, you know, interestingly, remember that Shakespeare was part of the demi-monde of the francophone demi-monde of London in Silver Street, as Charles Nichols pointed out. And there were the Marian exiles, the Protestants who'd been in Geneva. Now, Geneva, you remember, Calvin had tried to close down, had tried to put limits, not only on speech, but on, you know, there was no dancing, drinking, dicing, let alone, you know, printing things. And I always find it very interesting. I think Shakespeare probably knew about, you know, what had happened in Geneva. And the poet, Clément Marot, was, in fact, he was cited for playing a game of tic-tac-toe, you know, what we would call noughts and crosses, with somebody. So even innocuous behaviours could be constrained. And these are not specifically about speech, but that speech is one of the freedoms, perhaps the foundational freedom, but there are a whole bunch of others. And so I think Shakespeare in Measure for Measure is thinking about sexual freedom, about, you know, and by sexual freedom, I mean, for instance, nearly in every play, it's about free choice in marriage, that you can choose your own spouse. That's a fundamental aspect of, you know, of literature, right? Almost the world over, that you fall in love with the person who's not ordained for you by the powers that be, but you must follow your heart, kind of thing. That kind of erotic freedom, as well as other forms of sexual license, that those are really, really associated with speech. And I think that Shakespeare's thinking about Geneva, he's thinking about enforced marriage, and people's capacity to speak up about these things, and that they all of those issues, I think, come together especially in Measure for Measure. And I have written a little bit about this, actually. I have a chapter on Measure for Measure in a book called Who Was William Shakespeare that I published a few years ago, and kind of compared the Geneva situation to the situation in London and the endeavours of the city fathers to deal with, you know, the problem of human sexuality. which obviously, you know, for women, the consequences of erotic license might be death dealing, you know.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for these wonderful rejoinders. I mean, 2 more questions. Can we take 2 more questions, ma'am?
I'm at your disposal.
Okay. Kavita Gopalakrishnan is asking something very interesting. Partly you have also referred to about the forest, the scope of speech in forest. So
Yeah.
Callaghan in Tempest is saying, "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises." So how is it only when people are out of one's place that one's speech gains recognition? That is her question.
Well, in the forest is this locus amoenus. It's this, you know, this ideal place. You can definitely speak there. But whether that speech will, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes, Amida, are you saying something?
Hello? Have I lost you?
No, it's okay.
Shall I
Amida,
continue?
you want to say something? Ma'am, you please continue.
Okay. Okay. So the green in the green world, there is always a certain kind of license. I don't think the Tempest is the green world. Remember that Callaghan hasn't been. He has not been exiled. He is in his own terrain, and this is the magical world, but also a world where there's a connection with nature. But not only that, Callaghan is the great poet of that play, in my opinion, not Prospero. And his is a kind of natural, seen as a natural language, by which I don't mean a primitive language. I mean a language that is attuned to his environment and kind of respects it. And I think there's a strain now of environmental criticism that's increasingly recognizing that if you can hear the music of the isle, then, you know, and you're attuned to that as Callaghan is, he, you know, but he can't speak freely to Prospero. Prospero tries to control his behavior, his life, etc., in this, you know, in his colonial apparatus, which he imposes upon Callaghan. But I don't think that's the idealized location in the way that As You Like It is, because As You Like It is an escape from court culture for the main characters. But with Prospero, he's escaped from the court, but he's escaped not to the sort of, you know, idealized natural world, but to a world where he wants to impose a rather brutal order on the indigenous inhabitants. So I see that as rather different. And I do think that Shakespeare is thinking there about the Virginia voyages, the voyages to Virginia, and Strachey's account of those voyages. So I think that situation is a rather different one. But one of the things I love, you know, Ban, Caliban, the range of musicality in The Tempest, the different voices from song to poetry. I mean, that's really, you know, it's quite the cacophony. But I love this, you know, assertion that thought is free. But of course, at the beginning of the play. But I think what we see is that authority is always wanting to tie people's tongues. I think that's what happens too in The Tempest.
Absolutely. Yes, this last question is from Otoshi Roy, who once again moves to another play, Twelfth Night. Feste's speech in Twelfth Night. Words are grown so false. I'm loath to prove reason with them. Would you like to comment on these?
Yes, those are wonderful lines, aren't they? That, you know, that language can betray us. It's an instrument, you know, of expression, but you can also have false assertions. And you know, my quotation from Claudius, you know, you see how evil characters manipulate language. You know, Feste is obviously the character of melancholy. He's a melancholy fool, and this sort of skepticism about powers of expression, I think, is totally appropriate to him. that language has multiple capacities, and Shakespeare deploys all of them, you know, from silence through to song throughout his oeuvre. But you know, that the powers that be can also wield language. Authority uses language. It makes proclamations and declarations. Again, you know, we might go back to Measure for Measure about this. What authority decrees. And remember that there are proclamations sent all across the country. You know, their town criers, you know, speak the proclamation. Trumpets are, you know, it's kind of ritual. You have your trumpeters on horseback, your town criers repeat it, then you nail up printed copies of the proclamation. You know, authority speaks in this period. Dissidence also speaks through the printing press, through the pamphlets, through the illicit printing presses, like the mobile printing press of John Penry that's going through the country. But, you know, and there are also occasionally, there are, as we know, false imprints on books. There are false proclamations, so people are often not sure what to believe. In fact, when Elizabeth dies, there are parts of the country that won't entertain the herald who brings the news of Elizabeth's death, because they're worried that it's a false, you know, it's a false statement. So you know, and there's libel, the slander at the more local level. There's always the misuse of language, the misuse of words, but that does not mean that because it can be misused, that it should be suppressed. And I think that that's what I would take from Shakespeare's oeuvre. But I'd love to know, you know, this has been a one-way conversation so far. I'd be happy to, you know, to listen to what you think on any of these topics.
Yes, thank you. I think we end the questions here. Omida, you can now take over. Thank you, ma'am, for being patient and answering all these questions. Wonderful.
It's been a delight. I'm only sorry I couldn't hear more of you know, your responses and thoughts. Thank you.
No, it's okay. Omida. Okay, Omida, you're muted. You have to unmute. Yes, actually, while you were speaking.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
You are audible, yes.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Well, before my closing comments, I would like to actually make two observations. One is, you know, don't you think by implication, the freedom of speech also implies a freedom of silence? Because there is a lot of examples in Shakespeare and poems where characters keep silence.
Yes, and Othello is, you know, in Othello, the example I gave from Iago, where he says, I have the right to stay silent. You cannot, even if you held my heart in your hand, yes, you cannot make me speak. And that, you know, that's sort of and Cordelia says, you know, love and be silent. It's, you know, but she wants to speak, but there's no point, you know, she must love and be silent. But Iago is this inscrutable character who's going to be silent. And remember that speech means nothing without silence, without the silent gaps like music. You can't hear. If it was only noise, you would have there would be no sound. It's always this interplay between speech and silence, sound and silence. Yes, good point.
Yes, another thing, you know, there is also the dimension of homosexuality, which was suppressed very ruthlessly, and you know, this freedom of speech also touches on that aspect. What is your take on that?
Well, sexuality in general, as I discussed in relation to Measure for Measure, was subject to constraint. We, you know, tend to not to say, you know, that the category of homosexuality, as Foucault has shown, didn't really exist then. There's a sense that there are homoerotic practices and relationships, but it didn't constitute a very firm identity in the way that it does for us. So sexual practices didn't always coincide with identity, but there's clearly a very strong homoerotic kind of culture. However, it's interesting that the sonnets 1 to 26, which are addressed to a male figure, people have gone on and on and on about whether it's, whether this is, a good friend or not. These are very sexual sonnets, and but the history of poetry kind of permits that, and obviously I think in every single play there are references to homoeroticism, in part because you've got an all-male stage, and for instance, someone like Mercutio, very much associated with a kind of homoerotic cast. I mean, what's interesting is there were statutes against what was called buggery or sodomy, but they were very rarely enacted. You don't get many people being actually executed for that. So I think that particular form of, oddly enough, as Stephen Greenblatt has pointed out, that the 1980s was probably more repressive about homosexuality than the 1580s. That there was, because you didn't have this coherent sense of identity. It's for instance, I'm a vegetarian. Nowadays we all have an identity. It's the same kind of thing, or is it just I eat vegetables? I mean, what's the distinction between that? But clearly it was a category subject, catamites, Ingalls as they were called, subject to opprobrium and discipline. And constraint, and even and prosecution, and even death in certain cases. But the expression of homoerotic love, especially in poetry, does not seem to have been a huge problem. That seems to have been something that you could kind of get away with. And I think of Adonis. I mean, Adonis is, he's not interested in women, that's for sure. And that's one of the kind of jokes of the play. And a lot has been written, obviously, about homosexuality and Renaissance culture by people over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think that's been very valuable in helping us think about the flexibility of sexual categories in the period, and also this odd way in which occasionally, homoerotic or homosexual relationships could be subject to dire punishment, but then often they weren't. And it's both of those things. And I think that contradiction is kind of interesting. But it's not a hard and fast. There isn't the sort of hard and fast homophobia that in the early modern period that there is in our own world, unfortunately, that there is in our own world, which is to be deplored, obviously.
Ma'am, thank you very much, Professor Callaghan. Thanks a lot to Professor Callaghan. We are really grateful that you opened up so many interesting vistas for us today. Thank you very much for your speech. Thanks to all the participants as well. Senior professors were there who had listened, and of course our students would be very beneficial from this. Professor Bhattacharya, I think, was trying to say that our upcoming lectures are also coming. This is primarily for the participants. No, I'm just completing, Amida, that I think our next lecture is Professor Erin B. Mee on 18th July. So I would request all the participants to be with us on that day. Right, ma'am. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate the invitation. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Yes, goodbye.